Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for the first day of the semi-finals at Worlds 2023. It is semi-finals time. The top 4 teams in the world have been determined, and we are now going to go game by game to see which of them will make their way to the World Finals. A very prestigious position for any of these teams to accomplish, but specifically for the 2 teams that we are going to cover here today. 2 very proud LPL organizations, one of which has tried very hard for very long to get to this position, and finally they feel like they have one of the best teams in the world, but they go up against one of the most unpredictable teams and organizations in the world, having rebranded from a finals appearance just 3 short years ago. It's going to be a lot of fun to go over, but if you guys are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. Would love to know your thoughts on what you thought was going to happen in this series and whether or not it lived up to those expectations for you, obviously. Love to hear your feedback. If you want to know what I think of these series kind of a little bit more in depth than what I will cover in today's video in terms of previewing, then go ahead and check out my semifinals preview vid. That's going to be linked up in the iCard right now. You can check that out if you're interested, but today we're just going to be going over day number 1 of the semifinals, the games that happened, and what I took away from them. By the end of this video, we will know the first of our 2 world finalists in 2023. So strap in. We've got a lot to cover. Quickly at the start of this video, I guess, I don't want to pander too much to you guys, but if you find yourself enjoying it within, the next 10 or 20 or 30 minutes or however long, go ahead and hit that like button. It really does help the channel out a lot more than you know. It helps get it into the algorithm, and it would really mean a lot to me. Also lets me know you guys are enjoying it, so hit that, hit subscribe if you're interested, but I don't want to pander to you guys. It's time to jump right into the analysis, of course. Today, we have a matchup between LPL opponents and, 2 organizations that are really interested in being here. It's the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming and the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming. Certainly an intriguing matchup because I think both of these teams certainly had tumultuous years to get here in the first place. I think it's kind of opposite narratives and opposite storytelling. BLG was really dominant for a majority of this year. They were able to overcome a lot of the flaws and quite frankly, the negatives that they showed in the spring regular season to end up getting into the spring finals. And then obviously they performed phenomenally at MSI. They were able to get to the finals of MSI, which is a major accomplishment. And again, like I said in the intro, this Bilibili organization has really been an org that has tried to win for a really long time. They've put a lot of money and a lot of effort into trying to build quote-unquote super teams, whether it's with players like Meteor or Fofo or Uzi. It just hasn't necessarily worked out for them. They've never really been able to actually attain the success that maybe a lot of other teams, were able to do in that time period. But this roster, this has been the one that's been able to get them over the hump, and it's a lot of players that were kind of overlooked by other organizations. A player like On, who was really overlooked by the org that they're playing off against in this semifinals series. A really good support for that team that just didn't get the value that he necessarily, actually attributed to them back, and now he's playing really well in Bilibili. A player in Elk who was on a really good WE team to start his career, but had to, slum it with Ultra Prime last year and really kind of look negative in that regard. Yagao, who's never been given the respect he's deserved. Jun, who's been stuck on Invictus. Bin, who, narrowly got traded to this team after winning MSI with RNG. Like, it's just a weird assortment, a weird amalgamation of these players together on this roster, but they've certainly been able to make it work, and a lot of them have become some of the best players in the world. And then for Weibo on the other side, it's just as interesting. Remember, this is essentially the slot that Suning had a couple of years ago. Weibo ended up taking over, ended up assimilating that roster into their organization, and from there, they've essentially taken the place of them. But that was the Suning team that made World Finals in 2020. Bin, on the other side of this matchup, was on that Suning team, and so you do have some history with this org if you want to consider it that. But as Weibo, they've just not been able to find the success that they've wanted over the first 2 years. They've definitely invested. They've definitely attempted to be a top-tier team. However, this year it really has kind of come together, maybe surprisingly. This is the most volatile roster they have ever fielded, and they've fielded some volatile teams, but the Shy in the top lane has been a major question mark for them. He has been massively positive for them over the course of this tournament, but is that going to be able to keep up against the best top laner in the world? In my opinion, is a player in Weiwei who has been a little bit more of a question mark at this tournament. Is he going to be good enough to play in the quarterfinals? Zhao, who has certainly not been on the top of his game. Light and Crisp have been really good, especially in the recent series, but they did not start this tournament very hot. There just are more question marks about Weibo, which is, I think, why a lot of people are considering Bilibili to be pretty major favorites in this series for a good reason. Is that going to be able to maintain? Well, I certainly picked Bilibili, but it's all up to who performs better on today's day. Who is that going to be? Well, we're going to have to find out by going game by game. Of course, we'll be giving a player of the game and a dead of the game for each individual game at the end of each series, or at the end of the series. We will give a player of the series to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow, and that means we get to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, a massive win for them to establish some dominance early on in this series and to establish that confidence and that momentum that they desperately needed. This is a confidence-based team, and for them to come out and just quite frankly dominate this game number 1, look incredibly good after the early game that they had, it's super impressive. I think the draft ideology from both of these teams was pretty on point in this game. I think both coming out with some advantages, both coming out with some disadvantages in my opinion, but both definitely doing everything they needed to, and then it was just Weibo that executed on those comps better. There was a lot of mistakes coming in from Bilibili, some uncharacteristic ones from some really good players that I'm very interested in talking about, but for Weibo, basically every good thing that you could possibly want to see out of them in this game ended up coming into fruition, which you've got to be very excited about, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Of course, we're going to go ahead and kick it off with draft analysis. That's how we start off on this channel. And like I said in the intro, I actually think the drafts for both of these teams are still relatively good. I think both kind of got a lot of the things that they were looking for, and I think the ideology behind it was very sound. Now, I think banning out things like Kalista and Caitlyn against Weibo is smart. Light has been a very consistent carry for them, and so you don't want to give him anything in the early game that can really make his job a lot easier, because that's most of the time where Light is going to be taken advantage of, is in those early laning phases. So I get the bans there, and then, you know, Jax and Rakan away from On and Bin, that makes a lot of sense as well. It's just kind of been a problem for a lot of other teams. Now, the Jarvan, I think, you know, theoretically could have been kept up on the board, but clearly Bilibili is comfortable playing the Vi, which I would consider to be the most consistent Jarvan counter in the current meta, at least in terms of just a 1v1 matchup. There are a lot of jungle champions that I think can do well pressure-wise into Jarvan, but Vi does a particularly good job, I think, of out-tempoing him in the early game, and so, you know, it's certainly something that it's okay to take off the board, and specifically if you don't want to B1 it, that makes sense, but Weibo ends up B1ing the Nico, and I love this. I've been talking about this the entire tournament. If you're gonna B1 a mid laner, I think it should be Nico. The Ori is just kind of fine. I think it's good, but I don't think it's nearly as good as people say it is. Azir is certainly matchup dependent. Even someone like Syndra that I really like a lot is pretty matchup dependent. Nico is probably the most consistent early game mid laner in the entire game, and I think being able to get her early on in the rotation is smart. Now, Yagao does answer with the Syndra, which I think is the best answer to Nico here. Syndra, in general, is a very good counter, because not only is she going to have tempo in the early game, but she typically is going to have a lot more pressure in the late game in terms of teamfight prowess. I love Syndra, even though a lot of other players at this point are very out on her as a pick. I'm still very in on her, and I think Yagao did well in this game, or, you know, good enough. It was just the rest of the team that ended up falling apart. But, you know, things like the Rumble being early picks I think are good. You know, a pick like the Belvath I think is very active here. And the Aphelios is obviously very good into Xayah. But for Bilibili, I don't think they got run over either. I think R4 Aatrox is very good in this matchup, so long as you don't completely screw up top lane. We will get to that. Obviously talked about how Syndra is good. I think their biggest mistake was R5 Rel, which I really don't love. I think Rel into Milio is just not the Rel matchup that you're probably looking for. Milio can actually shut off a lot of what Rel wants to do. And so I don't know why you would go R5 Rel here. Maybe you just wanted some consistent engaging. You didn't want to worry about the fact that you were going to have to deal with that early on in laning phase. But in general, I actually think Bilibili comes out on top in draft. I think they have more advantages, especially in their solo lanes that they can take advantage of early. And this is a comp that does spike very, very hard in the mid game. When you're looking at like the mid game 3v3 skirmishes that you're going to get around objectives relatively consistently, I think this Bilibili team is kind of built to dominate those. And that's the strongest part of the game, in my opinion. And so off of draft, I would have said BLG was better, but the problem is that Weibo just outplayed them basically at every aspect. Bilibili did underperform in this game, do not get me wrong, but you do have to give a lot of credit to the Weibo players. Player of the game is going to go to the Shy in the top lane. Talked about this in my preview and my, you know, expectation video for this semifinals, my preview for this series as a whole, but the Shy is definitely a player that has notoriously kind of taken a lot of games and a lot of seasons off because he just hasn't necessarily wanted to grind as hard. He has notoriously not played a lot of solo queue and not taken solo queue pretty seriously. seriously, but in a tournament where clearly he is taking it seriously and he is trying, he is still one of the best top laners in the world, which is crazy to say. But Bin has been the best top laner in the world in 2023, and the Shy mega gapped him in a losing matchup, which is super impressive. The Rumble was very good. He got down super early, was down like 20, 25 CS at like 5 minutes into the game or something ridiculous like that. Was basically shut out of CSing early and ended up coming back to just like dominate this lane, was up multiple levels, was getting solo kills, was dominating the rest of the map. A lot of mechanical like outplays from the Shy. It just was a pretty miraculous performance from him. This is what he's been doing at this tournament up until this point, and I'm done doubting the performances that he's going to put out for the rest of this tournament. If this is the version of the Shy that we're going to get when games actually matter, when he is actually invested, then I'm going to buy in, because this was really good. Now, you got to give a lot of credit to his teammates as well. I think Weibo is going to fly under the radar for how good this Bel'Veth game was. This was a first-time Bel'Veth. He's never played her in pro before. Obviously, not first time ever. I assume he's played her in solo queue, but this is the first time he has ever picked Bel'Veth on stage in the World Semifinals, which is crazy, but he did a great job of establishing tempo early, and quite frankly, he controlled the map here. Jun really struggled to do anything on the Vi, and this is why I'm kind of critical of the Vi pick. I think it's pretty much just a Jarvan counter pick in the current meta, and so for him to struggle so much in a matchup that he probably shouldn't have taken in the first place, it's definitely questionable, but I think Weiwei did a really good job of making sure that the tempo was always in favor of Weibo, and that it was going to be relatively easy this game. Crisp was phenomenal on the Milio. I'm a huge fan of Crisp. He's somebody that I've praised a lot over the course of this year. There's been this narrative that Crisp has not been nearly as good ever since he left FPX. I disagree with that. I think this version of him on Weibo has been just as good as he was on FPX. People just aren't paying nearly as much attention. Light is getting a lot of the attention. Xiaohu and the Shy are getting a lot of attention. Crisp falls under the radar, but he has genuinely been phenomenal for this team. He had his struggles at the beginning of Worlds, but he's been very good ever since the first 2 days, and he was dominant in this game on the Milio, showing just how strong that pick can be. Xiaohu and Light were both good, but honestly not super necessary in this game. Top 1 super hard, jungle 1 super hard, and support was moving everywhere, and from that point onwards, it's really easy to play mid and bot in those circumstances. So really good stuff from Weibo, but for Bilibili, it's just a disaster. Done of the game is easily going to go to bin. What happened here? How do you go 0-6 on Aatrox into Rumble? Aatrox has been dominating this tournament. Basically every single top laner has been playing him at a very high level, even prioritizing him very highly. Whether it's the Shy, whether it's Bin, whether it's Zeus, it's everybody right now that has been able to pick up that champion and perform. And Bin was in a good matchup, and he was in a great position, being up 20, 25 CS, basically shutting the Rumble off from playing the game, and he somehow, through that lead, allowed the Shy to get back into the game, and just got outplayed for the rest of it. It was really disappointing. This is the worst game that Bin has played in a very long time, and it's a very bad time for him to do that. This is a player that is not known for choking under pressure. In fact, in the LPL, he's known for getting better as we get to the playoffs, and so it's certainly something that's going to be monitored, but the Shy is playing at such a ridiculous level that he's even making the, Bin look really, really bad, which is certainly something to keep in mind. Like I said, I think R5 Rel is just a bad pick in general, and it did not work out. Milio just shuts this pick off, and Rel could really do nothing. On had a pretty bad game, and the rest of the team didn't do much either. Yagao, I think, struggled with some of the combos, got outplayed by the Shy in that last team fight, as we kind of saw, or in that late game team fight, but he was good outside of that, and Jun was trying to create pressure, but he lost it so early to the Bel'Veth. There really wasn't a ton he could do. This just wasn't a great game for Bilibili. The Bin getting destroyed on the top side, and then On not being a presence at all, making this essentially like a 3v5 is really difficult to end up dealing with, and Weibo capitalized on that well. I think if they're going to play like this is going to be a quick series, because this genuinely was just Weibo outplaying them, but it's never good to count Bilibili out. We've seen what they can do even at their worst throughout this year. This is a team that can still easily come back and win this series, but they do have to win this game number 2. They're going to be in a really bad position if they can't do that. So is Weibo going to take a dominating 2-0 lead, or is Bilibili going to tie everything up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and we've got ourselves a fun one here. It's not going to be a blowout in either direction at the very least. Right now, we're going to at least 4 games, which is good, and Bilibili definitely looked a lot better here in game number 2. It just felt like they were off on game number 1. It didn't feel like there was a lot of the fight that we've kind of seen from them throughout the year, a lot of misplays, a lot of just individually getting gapped, which is really not something we're used to from this roster, but, leave it to them to bounce back here in game number 2, and for Weibo to struggle a bit more. The bot side in general, I think, was very questionable, maybe from both sides in terms of the execution, but one bot side, I think, definitely performed a little bit better, which we will definitely get to. But, of course, as per usual, we get to start with draft, and I think draft is certainly interesting to discuss here in the semifinals, because once again, I think my draft analysis is wrong in terms of the outcome. In Game 1, I thought Bilibili had the better draft. I thought they had more tempo in the early game, and, you know, definitely more in the mid-game, and that's really where I thought that they were going to take a lot of their advantages. And then in Game 2, generally, I would say that Weibo has the better draft here. In the second game, I think Caitlyn Lux is really strong right now, especially early, and Caitlyn doesn't fall off nearly as hard as people say that she does. You know, her mid-game's not exactly the strongest in the world, but you get her to 3 items, you get her to that team fight stage in the back half, she still is going to be able to carry some games. You pair that with a counter pick on the top side with R5 Aatrox. You've got Maokai and Azir for just scaling properties. You've got options here, and I think in general, Weibo is good, but the problem is, quite frankly, the Sylas on the other side of the map. In general, in terms of like what I would expect from a draft like this, Sylas is, in my opinion, the biggest problem that Weibo has to face. Now, Sylas was a problem this game. Yagao was fantastic, and we will get to that, but it really was the bot lane that ended up being super positive. This Varus-Ashe duo bot, obviously, it can be rather annoying to play into, but generally speaking, I would think that Caitlyn Lux actually should be able to beat this relatively efficiently. I don't think they did, obviously, but I don't hate this idea from Weibo to just default to the Caitlyn if it's up. I think it's relatively strong. The problem was that Crisp really underperformed, really misplayed, and Light also misplayed in a lot of these circumstances. And on the other side, like BLG, while they didn't exactly make any phenomenal plays, they definitely did enough to be able to control that lane phase and then eventually take the game out of control. Player of the game for me is going to go to Elk in the bot lane here for game number 2 on the Varus. I like the Varus. I think it definitely deserved to go to one of the 2 bot lane members here. And while I do think On had a bigger impact on the game, I also think he played worse. And so it's kind of that balancing act, right? If I don't think Elk or On was the best performing member of the team, I think that probably goes to Yagao in the mid lane in terms of the execution of what we saw, but Elk and On were certainly the 2 most important and impactful, I guess, members of BLG in game number 2, so one of them kind of had to get player of the game, and I think On just missed too many skill shots for me to give it to him, so I'm going to give it to Elk, who was very good. Now, he did make a mistake down the stretch where he basically flashed in to try to get a meaningless kill down the stretch that could have cost him the game, but that's Elk. That's what you sign up for. He's the most aggressive AD carry in the world. I've said that for multiple years. It's the reason that a lot of people really like him, but it's also going to get him in at least a little bit of trouble every once in a while. I like Elk, but the Varus game was solid. I think especially the laning phase where he really was able to establish his dominance and really establish the tempo and the prio that BLG was going to be able to generate for the rest of the game. Obviously, the Ashe helps out so much. We've seen a resurgence in Ashe in terms of the support position. You know, T1 kind of popularized the marksman in the support position, but in general, I think a lot of teams have really started to pick it up recently. Ashe is a champion that I think a lot of supports are going to pretty easily be able to pilot. Really doesn't take all that much skill in terms of being able to play her at a high level, as we kind of saw in this game. No offense to On. I love him as a player, but he didn't exactly play great in this game, and he still kind of dominated. It's just really strong. I think Caitlyn Lux is a relatively good counter, and, you know, I think in a lot of other circumstances, we're going to see some teams be able to pull out Lux or Milio or even something like a Renata and actually be able to do quite a bit in that circumstance. Even something like a Janna, I think, could be relatively interesting in a circumstance like that, but, you know, if you're going to misplay, you're going to misplay, and it's going to open up opportunities for BLG to win. Like I said, Yagao was really good. June, I think, did a much better job of controlling tempo here. I still don't love the Vi. I still think, in general, I'm not going to be prioritizing that champion unless I'm going into Jarvan, but, you know, June's really good at her, and so it's fine to be able to do that here. And then Bin definitely did struggle. He continues to really just kind of get outplayed by the Shy. Now, he was in a worse matchup in game number 2. In game 1, he was the one with the Aatrox. He was the one sitting in a pretty good position. In game 2, it's the Shy with the Aatrox on R5, and I think Aatrox does really well into Jax. It's a counter matchup, in my opinion, and the Shy definitely executed on that. It just wasn't enough to be able to give Weibo the win. So Bilibili was good. Mostly the bot lane and the mid lane, I think, looked really good this game, but for Weibo, it's a frustrating game 2 loss because, honestly, you probably should be up 2-0 in this series in terms of just, like, what you were able to get in this draft. Now, Maokai's obviously not great because Sylas can just steal his ultimate and be more useful than him in the late game, but everybody else is super valuable here. The Aatrox is crazy good on the top side, and the Shy did a good job of winning, but Light and Crisp absolutely needed to step up. They've been very good in the recent games for this team, but they very much underperformed here when they needed to step up the most. It's definitely not what you want to see, but Crisp is going to get done of the game. This Lux performance was pretty horrendous, and that's disappointing. He's played his worst games of the year by far at Worlds, and that's definitely not good. This is a former world champion. It's not like it's somebody who's, you know, maybe shy under the lights or somebody that we could expect to underperform in a situation like this. This is somebody who has performed at the highest level before, who has been able to win Worlds. And for him to really struggle at this tournament, it's concerning. This was a bad game, and he's had a couple of these. Most of them on Alistar, but this one on Lux is especially bad because if he were just like average in this game, I do think Weibo probably wins it, because if this bot lane wins, this game completely flips on its head early, so worth noting. I don't think Light played well either. I just think Crisp played a lot worse, in my opinion. But Zhao, who I think was fine, was doing a lot of damage, but again, in a pretty bad matchup. Really, the only losing matchup for Weibo here is the Azir. He's going to be fine in the late game, but Sylas actually is a major problem, and then Weiwei had no pressure. But the Shy was really good. He continues to look elo held here at Worlds, which is crazy to say, considering he was the one elo helling everybody else on this team in the LPL. Certainly something to keep in mind, but for Weibo, you do have an opportunity to take the series lead back, but you're going to regret it if Bilibili can come out and win this game number 3. That's going to put you in a lot worse of a position, and you really should have walked away from game number 2 in a better spot had you not underperformed so much. So, who's going to be able to take that advantage in this series? It's basically an LPL regular season best of 3 now. Is it going to be Bilibili or is it going to be Weibo? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series, this time 2-1. They're going to regain full control, and this is the Weibo I think we all wanted to see in this series. We didn't know if they were going to show up. We didn't know if they were going to be that team that, you know, outplayed JD Gaming twice over the course of the regular season in the LPL in 2023. We didn't know if we were going to get the best version of this team or if they just got a lucky draw in the quarterfinals by getting to play off against Gen.G. Well, it turns out Weibo is actually pretty darn good because they're now 1 game away from the World Finals here in 2023, which is insane. This team barely snuck their way into Worlds in general through the regional qualifier, and they end up being the team that ends up, you know, going 1 game away here in semifinals. It's an incredible achievement. A lot of these players are playing great, but Bilibili, a team that has been great throughout this year, that ended up taking down the #1 seed from the LCK, is on the brink of elimination here in the semifinals in what would be an upset, and they certainly don't want to let themselves go out quietly. Let's go ahead and talk about it, starting, of course, with draft. This is the first game where I can really say that one team, like, was super favored in draft. I think there were definitely moments where both BLG and Weibo were, you know, favored in draft through games 1 and 2, but it didn't end up mattering because the outplays were big. But this game, I can definitively say that Weibo dominated the draft here. I think basically across the board, you're looking at a better team comp. A lot of it is the B2 Poppy, which I think just completely shuts off a lot of the ideas that, you know, Bilibili wants to go for in this game. They R1, R2, Kalista, Vi, and then they get Poppy picked into them. That's a disaster for them, and it's really shocking that they would let themselves kind of fall into that trap. Both of those champions essentially get shut off by Poppy, and there's very little that they can actually do into her, so Weiwei was big here, but even in the individual lane matchups, I don't think they're doing all that bad. Syndra can certainly survive, especially with Poppy going into the Akali. You have Varus Ashe, which dominated game 1, and I think Kalista Caitlyn, which we will talk about, is just significantly less good. I get the idea of Caitlyn support. We've seen what it can do in the hands of a player like Keria in 2023, but I think in the hands of On, it's clearly not the same thing. And then Graves on B5 going into the top lane, a miraculous pick. Flandre is somewhere freaking out right about now. But the Shy looked amazing in this game, and I guess that's where we can start. The Shy is a pretty easy choice for player of the game for me. Once again, this guy just continues to dominate. He has been, like, arguably the best player at Worlds. I think it's between him. I think Bin was certainly in the conversation before this series, but Bin's getting, like, mega outclassed in this series, which is just certainly not what we would expect, but it's between probably the Shy and, like, Ruler, I guess, is probably in that conversation. I think Owner has obviously been super good, but Knight's been good as well. There's been a lot of options, but the Shy might be #1 of all of them. I would have told you it was Bin, like I said before this series, but the Shy is, like, mega gapping him. Now, it's worth noting Graves is pretty good into this matchup. Aatrox has been pretty untouched at Worlds so far in terms of the matchups that he's been able to get. I think Bin felt very confident going for the blind pick here. He had picked Jax, you know, B1 on blue side because that's his champion, and, you know, he felt he could dominate on it. It didn't end up working out because the Aatrox is such a strong pick into that champion right now, but being able to get the Aatrox himself, you would think he'd be able to deal some damage here. The problem is that Graves is actually a great pick here to be able to neutralize that early. One of the reasons that I really like this draft a lot for Weibo is not only because you have the Poppy to really shut down a lot of what, you know, Kalista or Vi or even like Akali would want to do throughout this game. And not only do I think you have advantages in all 3 lanes, but you scale significantly better than the opposition here. So once they were able to generate that lead, once the Shy was able to get online with the Graves, he's going to be able to dive on this backline and just like auto attack, you know, auto attack and kill everybody. And it's super free. It's complete freelo. So, you know, really good stuff from the Shy, but once he did get the ball rolling, like, Graves is going to get out of control. This is a really good pick in this circumstance. Crisp was a lot better in this game, I want to say. Kind of back and forth, you know, I want to say that, you know, the bad games from Crisp are definitely more outliers. I know people who are just watching him at Worlds, who haven't watched the LPL, are going to think of him a little bit more negatively, and I do understand. I'm not going to sit here and try and defend every single game that he's played at this tournament up until this point, but he is better than what he has shown at Worlds, and I hope that some of these games end up pointing that through. This was the better Ashe performance out of what both him and On were able to put through the last 2 games. On had a better scoreline, but I think Crisp definitely played a lot better. Light continues to be solid. Xiaohu was good in this game. Weiwei was mega influential on the Poppy, but most of that was probably the champion. Just in general, I think Weibo played really well, but it's the Shy who continues to be the driving force for everything Weibo Gaming is doing, and this really does feel like 2018 version of him. He feels locked in and motivated, and he's playing at a ridiculous level. And for Bilibili, they just don't have an answer to that. They have the best top laner in the world, and they are losing on the top side by a lot. Bin is going to get another dud of the game here in game number 3. If Bin's going to get run over in this matchup consistently, I don't really see an avenue for Bilibili to do all that well. I saw top lane as a very Bilibili favored matchup. I thought that even if the Shy was playing at a super high level, the most that would do was equalize this out. But it has not been equalized. The Shy, I keep calling him the Bin. The Shy has dominated Bin so much across this series so far, it's actually absurd. Bin has not lost to anybody this year. I can't stress that enough. As somebody who's watched every single game of the LPL, both spring and summer, playoffs, whatever, right? Bin has not lost to anybody this year. He has just kind of been fine in every single matchup. These are his worst games of 2023, and they're happening in the semifinals of Worlds. Now, that's definitely frustrating, but you can't even really say that it's been underperforming. He is obviously underperforming because he's losing so hard, but we know this guy steps up when it matters the most. When he was in the World Finals with Suning in 2020, he played phenomenally. We know he doesn't, you know, cave under pressure. This is just the Shy being better than him in this series, which is miraculous. Shun continues to force the Vi here in these games, and I hate to say it, it's just not working. He gets mega countered by the Poppy in this game. If he's going to continue to go to this, like, Bilibili's going to be in trouble. He can play a lot more than Vi. I don't understand why they're prioritizing her so high in draft, and I certainly don't understand why they're just, like, not going to anything else. It's not working for this team. Elkanon ended up losing. I think Caitlyn's support is risky in this matchup and ends up not working out for Marksman, by the way, in the bot lane. Is this just the meta we're devolving into right now? Certainly interesting, but Elk certainly wasn't doing great. He gets shut off by Poppy. Yagao did do some interesting things. He's been by far the best player on Bilibili in this series. I don't even think it's been particularly close, but it's just not mattered. It seems like a team gap, especially on the top side, which for BLG is about as big of a disaster as you could possibly ask for. If Bin can't step up, if Bin can't even survive in these matchups, that is about the worst case scenario you could possibly think of for BLG. It's definitely disappointing, but they've got time. Now their back is up against the wall, so they do have to win this game number 4, but if they can, they're going to be moving to a game 5, and that's going to make things a lot more interesting. Can Weibo close this out in 4, or is Bilibili going to keep it alive? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Bilibili Gaming. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up the series at 2 apiece once again, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 in the semifinals. This is what we were looking for. Back and forth and back and forth. A great win here from Bilibili. This was a pretty dominant game from them. A couple of their players played phenomenally, and really, there are a couple of players that do not want this team to go home early. They want this team in the World Finals. If they can do it a little bit more consistently, then they should be able to get it done. But Weibo going for a pretty unique draft, to say the least, going for a lot of, I guess, surprising picks in this that I think theoretically could work out. I really don't hate the draft that Weibo had, but you needed to be able to win fast, and you just weren't able to do it. When you're playing against Jax, Sedge, Ori, Aphelios, you're on a timer. You're not going to be able to survive forever, especially with Quinn and Ashe and Heimerdinger. You're just never going to be able to survive in the back half of this game, and unfortunately for that timer, it ran out for Weibo. They weren't even really able to generate any sort of pressure in the early game either, which is when this comp really needs to take advantage of it. I don't think in principle it's like the worst thing of all time. I just don't think I would have necessarily drafted this team, but let's go ahead and talk about that. with the draft overview, B1 Orianna is fine. I'm tired of talking about this pick like it's the worst thing in the world. It's really not the worst thing in the world. Orianna is a solid champion. She's probably the most consistent mid laner in the game, and she does a lot of good things. I prefer Nico, but Nico's banned out this game, so you're fine picking Ori. She is counterable, and Weibo did counter her with the Syndra. It's a very good matchup into Ori. It can survive early. It does really well in that lane matchup, and then is going to be, relatively speaking, just as strong, especially if Syndra is going to be able to generate that lead in the mid game. Then all of a sudden, you know, Ori's not going to be nearly as dominant in that matchup. It's probably the matchup in the meta that I would say is Ori's worst, in my opinion. Akali is definitely up there, but the Syndra, I think, is a little bit stronger, and Xiaohu played well this game. He is the only one on Weibo to play well this game, but he certainly did some things, and I think that matchup was definitely the positive. Now, the rest of this board is very, very weird for Weibo. You've got the R4 Quinn, you've got the R5 Heimerdinger. Certainly not things that I would have anticipated in Game 4 of the semifinals at Worlds, but, you know, a lot of risks being taken here. I don't love the Quinn. I don't even think it really beats the Jax early, and Jax is certainly significantly more consistent, especially as the game continues to go on. You've got the Ashe Heimer, which was really strong at Worlds last year, but Aphelios Bard is just going to outscale it, and obviously On had a magnificent game. We will get to that, but you know, you really got to win this fast and early if you're Light and Crisp, and Crisp had a really bad game, and so they weren't able to win early either. Just a lot of risks to being taken in draft that I just don't think needed to be taken. I really don't think it changed kind of the identity and the ideology for what these teams wanted to do all that much, and I think it really put Weibo on the back foot as soon as they lost the early game, so that was a problem, because look at this comp. Like, you're never going to outscale Bilibili. You needed to have some insurance policy. And quite frankly, Weibo just doesn't have that. Credit to Bilibili. I think they played fantastic. Player of the game could go to one of two players. I don't really know which one I would personally, like, 100% give it to, because I think both of them played so out of their minds. But I'm going to give it to Yagao, at least in this video, because I think Yagao has been slightly better throughout the rest of this series. He really has been Bilibili's best player in the semifinals so far, but On was terrific on the Bard. If you want to give it to On, give it to On. If you want to give it to Yagao, give it to Yagao. I do think it has to go to one of those two players because they really were the most influential, but On was everywhere on the Bard. This is a champion we're not seeing at all right now in the meta, but if you play Bard at a high level, you can still perform well, and we know On can be a pretty big playmaker. That's what you need to play Bard at a super high level, and this was like a legit carry Bard. Like, he was everywhere on the map, constantly making an impact. He was way more important than the Heimerdinger, even in the isolated 2v2 lane, which is kind of hard for the Bard to do. He was just fantastic, but Yagao's damage down the stretch of this game was just simply too important. Like I said, Yagao has kind of been the best player on Bilibili in the semis so far, and that's majorly important. I was kind of questioning whether or not mid would matter at all in this series. It kind of has. Yagao being as good as he has kind of kept Bilibili in this series, and he's kind of brought them to a game number 5, which is major. Ori can still make a major impact even in a counterpick matchup. She is obviously going to scale well, but when Yagao just outplays Xiaohu, it doesn't really matter. Now, Xiaohu still played relatively fine. Like I said, he was the best player on Weibo in this game, but it just didn't end up mattering. Yagao was just simply better, and then, you know, the rest of the team was good too. I think Jun was good once he got off the Vi. You know, it gets banned out from Weibo. I think that's kind of a bad play from Weibo. I think the Vi was actually helping them quite a bit to be able to win some of these games. The Sedge, I think, is significantly more difficult to actually end up dealing with, and Jun, I think, did a good job of that. Bin was a lot better in a really good matchup here. You know, Quinn is obviously not the champion that a lot of people want her to be. You know, we see a lot of LPL top laners pull her out sporadically throughout the LPL split, but to pull her out in semis is crazy from the Shy, but he pulled out Graves in Game 3. Maybe he was just feeling himself a little bit too much in this one. It did not work. And then dud of the game for me is going to go to Crisp in the support position. It's been, you know, back and forth in this series. Crisp has been back and forth. He was awesome in Games 1 and 3, was really a big part of why this team was able to win both of those games, and he was really bad in Games 2 and 4. They're really going to be counting on him to turn that around in game number 5. Mages have never really been his specialty. He has always been more of an engage-oriented player, even back on FPX. Once, you know, this meta started moving in that, you know, more, you know, enchanter, mage, marksman-oriented, you know, meta in the support position, I don't think Crisp has necessarily been as good in that spot. I think if Renata ends up going through again, I would be surprised to not see that, because it really is by far his best enchanter in terms of performances. But again, he's much more of an engaged player. I still think you can play engage in this meta. It's not like the enchanter meta has completely taken over again, that marksman can't be countered. I do think that, you know, there are some good supports you can still play, and to ban out things like Tahm Kench and Rakan on your side is certainly interesting. I get that Ashe Heimer is a strong lane, but Crisp is just clearly not prepared to be able to play those at a super high level. I like Crisp, but it's just not working on these picks. And then It's not like anybody else was better. The Shy got gapped in game number 4. It's fine. He picked Quinn and got absolutely destroyed. It's going to happen. Weibo was nothing on the rel. This is a champion that once she gets behind is completely useless because her engage is all she has. And so if she goes in and just dies instantly, there's really nothing else that this champion can do. Like I said, Xiaohu was definitely the best performing member of Weibo in this game, but how much did it really matter? Really not at all. This Syndra's a good pick, but for Weibo, you've got to be able to solidify things in the early game. What we have seen so far from all 4 games is that whoever wins fast, whoever wins early, is able to take these games. That's been indicative of both of these team seasons. Both Weibo and Bilibili are early game focused teams that have been able to win fast and quick by outplaying their opponents, but only one is going to be able to take away game number 5. Are we going to continue to see some more marksmen and enchanters in the bot lane? Are we going to see some, regression back to more standard comps from teams that are on the brink? It's going to be interesting, but the winner of this next game will be moving on to the World Finals, and the loser will be eliminated here in the semis. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 5. They're going to take this series, and you bet your ass, Weibo Gaming is going to the World Finals. I can't believe this is happening. I genuinely cannot believe that they won this series. I genuinely cannot believe that Weibo Gaming is going to be in the World Finals in 2023 with how this team has played. It's not entirely surprising, but it is surprising. You know what I mean? Like, it's really hard to pin down this even being a possibility in the first place, let alone it being the reality that we end up coming to here. Weibo has looked massive throughout the year. I got a lot of pushback back in like March or something for putting them in my top 3 LPL teams. People were like, you're insane. They just beat Gen.G. They can't be consistent at all. And I stuck by this team. I believed in them a lot more than I ever believed in them last year as a team. And here we are in the World Finals. I'm certainly not going to say I predicted this. I never in a million years saw this coming. Even in this series, I thought Bilibili was going to be able to take care of business and they were going to be able to make their way there. But Weibo has done it. They are one of the top 2 teams in the world right now. And they proved that in this series. And in this game number 5, unfortunately for Bilibili, this is the end of the road. I think generally semifinals is actually a pretty good outcome for Bilibili. Not because I think they're like an awful team where it's like, oh my god, I can't believe we got to semis, but rather I think they're just about a top 4 team in the world, somewhere around T1 and, this Weibo team that they took to 5 and a team like Gen.G that they beat in round 1 and 5. Like, they're a good team, and there are a lot of good teams. I think semifinals is a relatively realistic outcome for this team that they can't be all that disappointed in, considering what the Bilibili org has been able to do over its time existing. But I think with the way that the bracket ended up being drawn, once they got past Gen.G, I think a lot of people, me included, expected this team to be able to make finals. And they just weren't able to do it. They weren't able to overcome the Weibo beast. And, it's unfortunate, but let's talk about Game 5 before we get to, I guess, big picture in this conversation. It was awesome. Awesome game number 5. Now, draft, I do think, is relatively even. I think both teams have their advantages. I do think this is definitely more Weibo favored, specifically because I think Ornn is really good in this matchup. Now, Jace can kind of tear apart Ornn individually, but it's top lane versus mid lane. It's not really going to matter all that much when Yagao is the one on Jason. Ornn does really well into Cassante as that counterpick matchup. It's amazing of the Shy in this winner go home game number 5 to pick a weak side top laner after he had been the one kind of carrying this team throughout this series. It's major balls coming in from Weibo, but it does pay off here because Ornn was awesome. And then the Maokai, I think, is big here. Silas is typically the answer, but they had banned it out, and they wanted to be one Maokai. I like this idea. June, in general, had really struggled this series playing anything other than Vi. The Sejuani looked good in Game 4, but it wasn't, like, phenomenal. It just was Sejuani, right? And so you're hoping the Maokai can make a lot of damage, but Azir scales really well. Kalista should have an advantage into something like the Caitlyn, even in the early game. You do have a lot of, like, positives coming in from Weibo. The problem is that you are a bit concerned that maybe the mid game is just going to get a little bit out of control. I think your scaling is better because of the Maokai, the Azir, the Ornn, the Renata. You have a lot of tools to be able to team fight in the late game, and Bilibili doesn't really have those. I mean, they're playing Jace Caitlyn, right? Like, that's going to be a bit of a problem, but I think in general, Bilibili did a poor job of being able to survive early. Now, this game was close. All 4 games before this were kind of blowouts. They weren't particularly interesting. This game definitely was interesting. It was a little bit more back and forth. Both teams definitely vying for their opportunity to make the World Finals. It was just Weibo who played better, and especially because of the comp they drafted, it certainly was an eye-opening experience. Player of the game for me in Game 5 is going to go to Light. I think you could realistically give this to Xiaohu as well, who was very good in this game. Both of them definitely deserve their props. They were the 2 carries. This team kind of invested into these 2 in this draft and said, you are going to be the 2 players that bring us across the finish line. And luckily for them, it does end up working out. The amount of Reddit posts that you would see if Danny, you know, picked this draft and then ended up losing and the Shy was, you know, not effective on Ornn and, you know, things ended up going wrong. The amount of negativity that you would see throw towards this draft is intense. It would have been insane, but luckily we don't live in that timeline. We get to live in the timeline where Weibo does end up winning and Light looks fantastic in this game on the Kalista. This is still a really good champion. I know a lot of people are really into Ashe and really into Caitlyn, and it's a really, really fun thing to be excited about. But there's a reason that Kalista has essentially been permabanned across this tournament up until this point, and that's because she's probably the, I don't know, the 3rd, 4th best AD carry in the meta, even over a lot of those other ones. We've seen, you know, both the Felios and Kaisa kind of fall out because late game scaling has not been nearly as effective against these best teams in the world. We've seen a bit of a different playstyle, I guess you could say, but Kalista is still really, really good and probably the best of the early game centric, early game focused AD carries in the game right now. And we definitely saw that. Kalista definitely can still do things in the mid game as well. I think she's underrated for that, better than Caitlyn in my mind. And then Xiaohu on the Azir was really good. Azir in general, I think, was really strong on B5 here. Not really a lot of answers, and scaling is an issue for Bilibili. So in general, those 2 definitely stepping up. A player of the series, it has to go to the Shy on the top side. How could I possibly give it to anybody else here in the semis? He was spectacular in games 1 and 3, and he was great in game 2 as well. Even the games that, like, they lost, like, the Shy was still pretty good in, with the exception of that Quinn game, which was definitely more questionable, and Ornn certainly wasn't, like, a game breaker in this one, but for games 1 and 3 alone, the Shy was, like, easily the best player in this series, and he is a worthy player of the series nominee and winner here, in my opinion. He was fantastic. If he's going to be able to play like this in the finals as well, who's to say he can't become a 2-time world champ? Weiwei was good in this game, wasn't perfect in the series, but good enough. Crisp certainly had his flaws in their losses, but in all 3 of their wins, he genuinely was very good. That's going to get lost in the shuffle because of games 2 and 4, but games 1, 3, and 5 for him were really, really good and definitely worth noting. But in general, you've just got to be excited for Weibo. You've got to be excited for this org, for this roster to be able to make their way into the World Finals. I did not think they were going to be capable of doing this, and yet here they are. They continue to overperform expectations, to shock the world with results, and this was definitely it. And then for Bilibili, it's a tough pill to swallow, man, but you just didn't play well enough here in Game 5. You definitely tried. I think players like Yagao and Elk definitely gave it their best effort. Even a player like Bin, I think, played a lot better here in Game 5 than he had been throughout this series up until this point. But there were some major underperformances. The Lux has not been a pretty positive pick for anybody in this series, and that continued with On here, who was bad, but dud of the game pretty easily for me is going to go to Shun in the jungle. Just a not good performance. I think a lot of people are going to say, oh, you ban out Jarvan against Bilibili, and all of a sudden Shun looks a lot worse, but he was really good on a lot of champions in 2023. It just wasn't a great series for him, and that's going to happen every once in a while, but it's definitely disappointing for BLG. I think you were looking at this series as one that you felt very confident that you were going to, or at least had an opportunity to be able to win. For this game to be so close, for you to have an opportunity and just get outscaled in the late game, it's definitely a sad way to go out. But when you look at the year as a whole for Bilibili, you're going to be relatively okay with how things ended up turning out. This is by far the best year this org has ever had. They have tried time and time and time again to put together a team that can do what the 2023 version of this roster could do. Elk and On are superstars. Shun has really emerged. Yagao was really good down the stretch, and Bin is still one of the best top laners in the world, even if he did get outclassed in the series by the Shy. A lot of positives this year from Bilibili, but it is going to have to stop at top 4 because Weibo is moving on to the finals. They'll play the winner of JD Gaming and T1 tomorrow, but man, you can never count this team out. This is a team that went 2-0 against JD Gaming in the regular season across this year in both spring and in summer. It's certainly going to be one to watch out for, but there is no team that they could take on the other side of this bracket that's going to feel good about facing off against Weibo. Alright, but that is going to do it for my World Semifinals Day 1 overview and analysis. We know now one of the teams that's going to be competing in the World Finals here in 2023, that being Weibo Gaming with the win, but they will take on the winner of tomorrow's, or right now's, semifinal series of JD Gaming and T1. I'm incredibly excited. I called that the real World Finals because I do kind of believe that those are the two best teams in the world right now, but Weibo can upset anybody. I'm really excited to go over that. If you want to know my thoughts, again, check out the video that's in the iCard, the semifinals preview video on JD Gaming versus T1 if you want my, in-depth thoughts on that series. But I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. And it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We've only got 2 more series remaining in 2023. We've got 3 more videos coming your way. It's going to be the overview of Gen.G T1, the preview of the finals, and then off-season content right around the corner. LCS, LEC teams are really already starting to shape up. We kind of already know what the leagues are going to look like. And so if you want content on how I think those teams are doing, what I think the offseason's looking like, this is the place for that. If you enjoyed this video, you're probably going to enjoy a lot of my other content. So hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.